in the founding of the nation, the founding fathers were concerned about monarchy. They wanted to go away from monarchy, but they also were concerned about anarchy. So the devolved mode of unitive consciousness would be monarchy or totalitarianism, fascism, a Unitarian sameness of oneness. But then on the other end of the spectrum, maximum diversity, which is the furthest you can get from unitive consciousness, perhaps, the devolved mode of maximum diversity would be anarchy.
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today, we're going to look at unity and diversity in American politics. Now, let me just preface this discussion by saying that in the last 45 years of my career as an interviewer, I have avoided current affairs completely, almost entirely, 99%. Today, I am making a definite exception, and the reason is because I couldn't have a better guest to discuss this with my good friend and neighbor, Glenn Aparicio Parry, who is the author of Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, nature, and humanity, as well as Original Politics, Making America Sacred Again. If you haven't watched the earlier interviews with Glenn, I would encourage you to do so. It'll provide real context for this discussion, which is going to focus largely on 21st century politics in the United States through the lens of his profound understanding of Native American culture and the role of Native Americans in the history and politics of the United States. Of course, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Glenn. It's a pleasure once again to be with you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Jeff. Thank you so much for everything you do.
You know, I prefaced this particular interview by reminding the viewers that I rarely cover current events in politics when I do interviews. And the reason is because I'm going for something timeless. I'd like to think that even though we're discussing current politics, by which I mean 21st century politics today, this interview will probably be useful to people who are listening 100 or 200 years from now, because I think we're going to have some touchstones that deal with perennial issues. And those are some of the issues that you and I have discussed in our previous interviews.
Oh, what a beautiful way to frame it. Thank you, Jeff. I mean, to me, as a person who agrees with William Faulkner, who said the past is not dead, in fact, it isn't even past, what's happening in the present always does reflect the past, and it also foretells the future. So it's very deep layers, and hopefully we can look at what's going on now through that larger lens. So thank you for that.
Well, I mean, some extraordinary things have happened here in the early part of the 21st century in the United States. We had the first female presidential candidate from a major political party. We have elected the first Black president, and we currently are in the days and the era and the regime of Donald Trump, who you identify very appropriately so as a trickster. And the trickster is a very important figure in Native American mythology, particularly here in the Southwest.
I would say that Donald Trump is a trickster even outside of Native American. You could look at him from other stories or mythologies. But in the Southwest, the trickster figure can be a human being that acts in a contrarian manner. In the Lakota tradition, that would be a heyoka, a contrarian manner opposite to what you might expect. So, for instance, Donald Trump has been cozying up to what we would have called our enemies before and berating our allies. That's completely opposite to what an American president would be expected to do. But the difference between Donald Trump and a Native American trickster is that Donald Trump is not a conscious trickster. A Native American trickster would be purposely engendering higher consciousness through shaking somebody out of their reality. It does not appear that Trump is conscious of his role, but I contend that he's fulfilling it nonetheless, and that consciousness is awakening. And I really see that here in America right now. I see Trump as a catalyst for unveiling America's shadow. And look at what's happening. Look at what's happening. When he first is elected, there's the Women's March, which was the largest march in history at that time. It's now been surpassed by the recent marches having to do with race. So when it comes to women, when it comes to race, when it comes to the Civil War, which Trump has resurrected in our consciousness, Americans are now seeing a little bit more how it really was, and change is afoot. It's really happening. And, in a very odd way, we have Donald Trump to thank for that.
You mentioned the Civil War, Glenn, and I think one of the things that we have to appreciate is even though the Civil War was fought 160 years ago, it's not clear to me that as a nation we have digested the lessons of the Civil War. It seems as if there's still an undercurrent of the issues from the Civil War that are still sort of bubbling up in our culture.
Yes. I completely agree with you. I would say that those issues were there from the very beginning, long before the Civil War, and those issues played out into the Whig Party, which was the original party of Abraham Lincoln, actually goes. It goes under because it's split into two factions. One that was for advancement of slavery into new territories, and one that was not for expansion of slavery. And what happens there is that the Whig Party goes under and the Republican Party of Lincoln is formed. The Civil War is fought, and we don't know what would have happened if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated, but he was. And he had oddly picked a Democrat, Andrew Johnson, to be his vice president, which we spoke about in our last interview, how similar he is to Trump. And so what was going to be the resurrection was very greatly slowed down, or the reconstruction, I should say, was slowed down, and in fact took 100 years until we had civil rights legislation. And even after civil rights legislation, we had continued to have systemic racism, which affects us today. So we really never resolved the Civil War, and we never looked at it honestly. I mean, I think one of the big differences between the United States and South Africa is that South Africa, after their apartheid regime, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they used a process of restorative justice to try to heal both the oppressed and the oppressor. You really have to do both. We've never taken an honest look at our race relations. We've never taken an honest look at the genocide that was committed against Native America. And we've never taken an honest look at the systemic sexism in our society, which is arguably even stronger than racism. But now I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that this is all coming out. And now it's a dangerous period too. I don't want to overstate the hope. I mean, there's a lot that can happen here, including sliding into outright fascism. But it doesn't appear at the moment that's what's going to happen.
You write about unity and diversity in your book. And unity, you describe basically two kinds of unity. There's unity within diversity, and then there's also a kind of unity based on sameness.
You know, I want to give credit to my California Institute of Integral Studies professor, Alfonso Montori. What a great guy. Besides being a wonderful scholar, he plays jazz saxophone and speaks 5 languages. And Alfonso Montori, originally, he describes himself as being from downtown Europe, but he was from Italy and very keenly aware of what happened in Italy. And Alfonso said to me, when I was speaking about unitive consciousness once, he said, be careful about unitive consciousness because fascism is also unitive. It's a unity of sameness. It's everything within the state, everything for the state, nothing outside the state, is how Mussolini defined it. And indeed, that's really true. And it made me realize that was the very dynamic between unity and diversity and unity through sameness was present at the very founding of the United States. The ideal of the founding fathers that was said in the founding documents really had not even come close to being realized. They spoke about how all men are created equal, but that meant all white male property owners are created equal in the founding of the nation. But the seed of that equality, inspired by Native America, has unfolded closer toward unity in diversity. But we've never gone away completely from the backlash that happens from time to time, where various leaders have tried to use the excuse of national security to build a reactionary support for white nationalism. I mean, Andrew Jackson was one of those, but Chester Arthur has the Chinese Exclusion Act, and even FDR imprisons Japanese Americans. So we've had a lot of instances in American history where we've made immigrants into the other. And also, of course, Native Americans is the worst example. They're not immigrants, but they're the people that were dehumanized by Andrew Jackson the most.
Now, I'm under the impression that this sense of otherness that comes up in sociology, comes up in politics, might have a biological basis to it. That, you can look at, for example, fish on a coral reef, fish of the same species, but who live on different parts of the coral will have slightly different markings. And if they venture outside of their territory into the territory of other fish of the same species, they will be attacked on occasion. So it seems if it exists in fish, it might be very, very deeply encoded into our genetic makeup.
It's definitely true. I often hold up Native Americans as an example of a culture that does have the greater unity and diversity, that in their politics includes the natural world. But even in Native American cultures, amongst the Dene, amongst the Haudenosaunee, amongst Blackfoot, there often is a word that describes that particular tribe as the people. And the implication is that those that are not of the tribe are less than fully human. So I think it is partly part of the human condition, perhaps, but I also think that we are evolving, perhaps, to accept greater unity and diversity, and maybe moving past that at some point. It could take thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but I think we have the impetus to do that now.
Well, one of the interesting points that you make is that at the time when Donald J. Trump was elected president in 2016, America had probably achieved a status of maximum diversity in terms of having just elected a black president, having nominated the first woman to ever run for the presidency from a major party. So it's not surprising that at a moment of maximum diversity, there would also be a backlash.
Yes, I chose the word maximum diversity carefully because in the founding of the nation, the founding fathers were concerned about monarchy. They wanted to go away from monarchy, but they also were concerned about anarchy. So the devolved mode of unitive consciousness would be monarchy or totalitarianism, fascism, a unitarian sameness of oneness. But then on the other end of the spectrum, maximum diversity, which is the furthest you can get from unitive consciousness, perhaps, the devolved mode of maximum diversity would be anarchy. It would be anarchy because everything is so diverse that there's that the society cannot cohere. So it doesn't have to be that way, and arguably we are not even close to our maximum diversity yet. But we are reaching the limits of what the system seems to be able to bear. So that's why there's somebody like Donald Trump, because if it wasn't Trump, it would have been somebody else who came forward to push back on this evolving inclusiveness that was growing, and to try to create unity through exclusion. And that's something we have to be very vigilant, aware of, and not let that happen, frankly.
Well, and I forgot to mention, of course, that at the same time during the Obama era, we also legalized gay marriage, which was a huge step forward.
Oh, yeah. And by the way, I always say this to people. I probably said it to you in casual conversation. I'm not sure that gay marriage would have become legalized, but a great euphemism evolved. And people started to call it marriage equality. And when that happened, there was an enormous effect occurred, and mainly amongst women, because women, I think, felt that in marriage, existing marriage, that they were needing greater equality. So when 60% of the American public was for marriage equality at the time that the Supreme Court made it legal all across the land, it actually broke down to only 50% of men were for marriage equality and 70% of women. That's pretty interesting, isn't it?
That's sort of almost a precondition for a backlash to occur.
Yeah, there's been a backlash, and in fact, yeah, that's also at the end of the Obama administration, we were having the last group of people that were beginning to gain greater rights in the society were transgender people, and that's something that the Trump administration has tried to roll back, but often unsuccessfully. I mean, for instance, when James Mattis was the Department of Defense Secretary, Trump made an announcement by tweet that that transgender people would no longer be allowed in the military, and Mattis's wise and measured reaction was to say, "Okay, we'll study this," and did essentially nothing. So it didn't really change in the way that Trump supporters maybe thought it did. You can't just change things by tweet, actually, not certain things.
One of the other paradoxes of Donald Trump as a trickster president is that although he was elected as a Republican, and although he certainly has a hardcore base of right-wing supporters, many of his policies are an anathema in terms of traditional Republican conservatism.
Absolutely. And one of the groups that I'm watching very closely now is called the Lincoln Project. It's begun by people like Rick Wilson, Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway, and others, disaffected Republicans. And the Lincoln Project is very interesting enterprise, and I think will probably be a determinative factor in preventing Donald Trump from winning a second seat, because so much of politics, almost like sports, this is something like Jerry Seinfeld would say, you don't root for the player, you just root for the uniform, because there's so much trading and stuff. But in politics, there's a large percentage of people who identify as Republican will vote Republican no matter who the candidate is. Donald Trump, just like you said, there were no Republicans in Congress that supported Donald Trump's nomination until he became the presumptive nominee, except for Jeff Sessions and a very few others that started to come on board. But he got a large percentage of the Republican vote. And because there's such a strong media attacks on Trump, rightly or wrongly, I would say mostly rightly, but the people who identify as Republican feel stronger, like they have to coalesce around their leader. So it's hard to chip off from that identified support, but it is happening, and people like the Lincoln Project are doing it successfully.
I mean, for example, Trump believes that tariffs are good, and that goes smack against traditional Republican conservatism. I think in the past, tariffs were largely a Democratic policy.
Well, yeah, and really had fallen out of favor in both parties largely ever since the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the around 1930 plunges us deep into the Depression. Tariffs have largely fallen out of favor. The problem with tariffs is that they have ripple effects. So when you put a tariff on one thing, like steel or something, the steel it's just not a standalone product. It's used in all kinds of other things. And so once you put a tariff on one thing, it's very hard to trace what's going to happen. And the world is getting even more interconnected. Yes, the tariffs didn't even work in Lincoln's time, actually. So they're really not working today. But you're right, there are other things too. I mean, obvious things I didn't talk about yet, but an anti-Russia policy or a strong policy against Russian aggression is something that Republicans held to more than Democrats, although Democrats were against Russia aggression also. There were so many things where family values. I mean, Trump is not he's been divorced many, many times. He's had many affairs. He's spoken about, this is not a secret. He is not somebody you can hold up to represent family values. So almost all the things in the standard Republican platform didn't apply to Trump. He posed himself as a populist, and that's a very dangerous thing. And I talk about that quite a bit because with populism, you always have the possibility of it eroding into fascism or a totalitarian regime. And we're on the precipice of that now.
One of the things that you point out is that originally the idea of the Electoral College, when it was created, I believe by the founders, is that the electors would serve as sort of a safeguard against a dictatorship or a populist president coming in who defied all of the previous unstated norms of American government.
Absolutely. That's what the purpose of the Electoral College is. There's a lot of debate about the Electoral College today. And one of the purposes of the Electoral College was to balance power between the urban and rural areas. And at least the intent of that had some efficacy. I mean, it was a compromise that was built between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. It's also part of why the capital of the country has moved from New York to D.C. And New York just becomes the financial capital. There were a lot of compromises made between urban and rural areas, and I personally feel there's still perhaps some reason to keep the Electoral College, but it needs some tweaks. And the original purpose of preventing an oligarch, or not an oligarch, an autocrat from coming in to power is obsolete completely, because the states design laws that force the electors to go along with the popular vote in their state. So that's no longer one of its purposes. I mean, there were people talking about it when Trump won the nomination. They were hoping some electors in the states that didn't pass laws against going with the popular vote would actually vote against their population. That didn't happen, but I mean, in theory, it could have. But there were other things. What I discuss in the book is that afterwards, the political parties became the gatekeepers. And now picture the old smoke-filled back rooms, the cigar-smoking guys. That's how decisions were made. And this happened as recently as 1968, you know, when RFK is running, also Eugene McCarthy, and Lyndon Johnson decides to drop out of his second term. Robert Kennedy wins 3 primaries in a row, and he's won the California primary. He has a lot of momentum. It's possible that he's going to become the next Democratic nominee, and then he's assassinated, you know, shortly after Martin Luther King was assassinated, a pivotal time in American history. But what happened in the Democratic Party then? Because the party elites held all the power, they installed Hubert Humphrey as the nominee, even though Hubert Humphrey never ran in any of the primaries. And Hubert Humphrey runs against Richard Nixon and loses narrowly. And after that, then the things start to shift in the Democratic Party. And in 1972, they decide to make the democratic process more open. Because there's a rebellion. They want, you know, the Democratic people were, you know, just like today with Bernie Sanders, they were pissed off that there was a prejudice against a popular vote. And so they open up the system, and George McGovern became the candidate in 1972. But he loses 49 of 50 states to Richard Nixon, which is kind of incredible because only a year and a half later, Richard Nixon is in deep trouble and ready, you know, and looking at resignation because of Watergate. But none of that had come out yet by 1972. So he wins 49 of 50 states. And that's when the Democrats make a compromise and they decide to have superdelegates, which are the ones that they feel best represent their party's interests, to have 1/3 of the power. And 2/3 of the power was determined by popular vote. But now that's been scuttled because of the rebellion against the way that Bernie Sanders was treated against Hillary Clinton. And the Democrats are now in the same position the Republicans were in, because the Republicans didn't have this safeguard. They didn't have superdelegates. And because they didn't have superdelegates, they let Trump win the nomination, even though their party leaders were against it. It's very confusing, isn't it? But the power of the people is not always necessarily the best thing. I just because the people can make big mistakes and they can be swayed by populist movements, as they were to some extent by Donald Trump.
Well, let's define populism. It's a term that I've heard a lot, and I know it's associated with certain people like George Wallace or Huey Long. Populists, I gather, tend to be demagogues. But what really is a populist?
Well, I'm not sure I know the best definition, but what it feels like to me is that these populist demagogues always appeal to the emotions of people, and they are not typically. They typically have very poorly thought out platforms or actual ideas for how to govern. So, Mussolini, was like that. I mean, he didn't really have a very well organized ideology. Donald Trump has no ideology. In fact, Andrew Jackson had no real political ideology, but knew how to appeal to the common man and get the emotions stirred up. The populist demagogue, it seems to me, is the one that's successful in stirring up emotion, and often very irrational emotion and dangerous emotion that is a backlash against a greater democratic urge or for greater unity and diversity.
Prior to Trump's election in 2016, whether we had a Democratic president or a Republican president, the dominant ethos was what you define as, and I've heard other scholars define as, neoliberalism. In other words, global capitalism. That seemed to be the implicit, accepted moral authority, Republican or Democrat. And it led to, I think, a 40-year period of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, and many other social issues kind of being shunted off to the side and not being really addressed. And so I suppose when a populist came along and said, hey, the system is rigged against you, it sort of struck a chord with people.
Yes, I mean, in the 2016 election, both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump were appealing in similar ways. Trump was perhaps more successful in stirring up anger among the people, but there was also, similar emotions were being stirred up by Bernie Sanders as well. You brought up a very interesting point, and neoliberalism. I'd love to talk about that. But first, when I talk about that, I want to say this. It's a very confusing term for most people. We're having a conversation, you and I are very familiar with the term, but I'd say the most Americans don't know what neoliberalism is, and they're confused by the term because it truly includes both liberals and conservatives. And so it's a very confusing term. And really what I mean by neoliberalism is just what the world order is. And I try to look at that fairly carefully because there's positives to the world order as it existed since World War II, and there's negatives. And there's a lot of the negatives are very much unseen because we're like a fish swimming in the neoliberal pond. We don't see the water we're in because that's everything. So I try to take that apart. And if I may, I'll take just a couple minutes. I mean, I would say, originally, yes, neoliberalism is multilateral capitalism with socially liberal policies. Okay, that's kind of the succinct definition. Things like the World Trade Organization, GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, the World Bank, all these are instruments of maintaining the world order, maintaining this multilateral trade. And there's a lot of good things about that. I mean, Thomas Friedman once claimed that no two countries that have a McDonald's have ever gone to war together. And that was disproved shortly after he wrote the book. But it's partly true that if you have multilateral trade, you're going to be, there's more social intercourse between different people, and less likely for sentiments of war to develop. You could look at that with China and America now. Even though it's extremely tense relations, there's a ton of trade that goes before us. So it's, in that sense, it's very unlikely we're actually going to go to war. But there's a whole big shadow side of the neoliberal world order. And I do delve into that also, because just the fact that we base our success on economics so much, and that political governments are run often by economists who are spurring on economic growth, ignores the fact that you can't grow infinitely on a finite planet. It ignores the damage that's been done to the ecology. And the damage is enormous. I mean, we are killing off species at a rate of somewhere between 10 to 100,000 times faster than what we might say is normal. So we really need to change and look at the consequences of neoliberalism. And there are other consequences as well. And the point is, neoliberalism is commodifying the world. Everything is becoming commodifying, not just, repairs to your home, children's birthday parties, dating. Everything is becoming commodified. And that's, I think, has some very deleterious consequences.
Well, especially considering the subtitle of your book, Original Politics, is Making America Sacred Again. And the commodification of everything is almost the opposite of the sacralization.
Exactly. So, the foundational basis of my book is looking at how Native American values inspired the founding fathers, and those deep values of intimate interrelationship with the land are the values that need to resurface now, and to some degree are resurfacing. If we look at it optimistically, when Rachel Carson comes around, and writes Silent Spring, she awakens people to the radical interconnection of the plant and human and animal kingdoms. So it's very much the case that the world is a radically interrelated whole. This value that is understood deeply in Native America needs to permeate the consciousness more and more. And we literally need to stop valuing money over ecological health and well-being. And people have been talking about this for a long time, but it is essential that we shift our values. Oren Lyons, who had the distinction of being at the United Nations with Mikhail Gorbachev, the Dalai Lama, and other leaders in I think the 1980s, and also Al Gore, who was then a senator. They came up with, in 4 words, a succinct motto: value change for survival. We have to change our values if we're going to survive. And that's where we have to take a good hard look at the neoliberal world order, which values money over everything. And to some extent, Donald Trump has worsened that condition, because for him, relations between other countries has more to do with transactional business opportunities than it has to do even with building friendships and alliances. So Trump has been a weird player in that he's both disrupted the world order, threatening to pull out of NATO and whatnot, and he's also strengthened it when it comes to certain addiction to oil and gas and things like that, even maybe as much or more so than his predecessors. So we really need to change. And I think I quote the Cree Indian proverb that says something like, only after the last fish has been caught and the last stream poisoned will we realize that we cannot eat money. Yeah, we can't.
Well, Glenn Aparicio Parry, this has been a very instructive conversation. I want to encourage any of our viewers who haven't heard the previous 2 interviews with you in this series to check them out because they're all very powerful and relevant. And I also want to let our viewers know that we have one more planned where we're going to talk about the return to wholeness in American politics. Glenn, once again, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you, Jeff. It's been very wonderful, as always. Thank you.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.